This is the last panel of the day, so thanks for hanging with us. Um, this is the moment where you think, have we saved the best for last? And we have saved for you some exceptional papers. So we have 5 presentations coming up. They're 15 minutes each, and we will go straight from one to the other, with me keeping time more than anything else. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Emily from the University of Kentucky. I've known Emily for most of my career, and I'm just so excited that she's joining us today. She'll be presenting Institutional Heterogeneity, Information, and Voting Behavior. Emily, take it away, and I'll manage your questions and Q&A and chat.
Thanks so much, Betsy. So I'm first going to attempt to share the right screen. So y'all are seeing a presentation now, hopefully.
Yep, looks great.
And just to echo what everyone else has said, thanks to all for hosting this fantastic conference and for adapting it to the terrible circumstances that Los Angeles is facing right now. So this is collaborative work with my longtime collaborator, Tiffany Barnes. And it started with thinking about, well, initially we were actually thinking about voting overseas, was how we got here. But what we found really interesting, so it became kind of some broader thoughts around absentee voting, and what we became very interested by is what would happen when individuals who needed to cast an absentee ballot were exposed to other individuals' absentee ballot casting rules, because obviously those are state specific. So if individuals are around other voters who are from different states, what happens when they learn about different voting rules from the ones that their state subjects them to? And I'll come back to this point at the end, but initially we just sort of envisioned a scenario. We were thinking about, for example, folks on military bases overseas, where you might have one individual saying, oh, well, I have to have my ballot in by this date, and another individual saying, no, it's not due until this date, right? And both could be absolutely true because they might be from different states. And so this becomes a particularly interesting question, we think, for college students who likely have a lot of peers who are from out of state and are often themselves casting absentee ballots, even if they are going to school in state. Also, folks on military bases, we think there are some interesting extensions when you have individuals in border media markets. So the example one of my colleagues had was she lived in Auburn, Alabama, where the media market is actually out of Georgia. So I think Columbia, Georgia. So all of the news and all of the updates about election procedures would be Georgia specific rather than specific to Alabama. And she said even among professor friends, there would be sort of confusion and uncertainty around the rules to follow. So we're curious to think about this issue. It taps into what some of the election officials were just emphasizing, that there is such variation at the state level. And we do have some sense of what that means, but we have some sense of what that means for voters in any given state, right? We can kind of compare voters state to state and how variation in election rules affects their experiences. And I feel like there's pretty broad consensus that if those rules lower the cost of voting, that's associated with higher turnout. Though lowering the cost of voting has mixed effects on things like voter confidence and perceptions of election fairness. And I think Lana Atkinson and some co-authors have a recent piece out that emphasizes there's likely they show there's a partisan effect here, right? So for Democrats, in places where the rules make it easier to vote, they feel more confident. But for Republicans, who, as Charles showed us on his graphs, favor rules that don't tend to favor rules that make it easier to vote, they're going to feel less confidence in those situations. So we know this about how state level variation in voting rules kind of affects the voters in those states. But again, we're interested in what happens when voters in a given state are exposed to rules from another state. And so there we can also think about some of the recent work being done on information about voting procedures, because the bulk of the literature on voting and information, right, for political scientists is like information about candidates. And that's not the kind of information we're interested in thinking about. We're interested in thinking about nuts and bolts information about how to participate in an election. And so recent research there has shown a kind of a mobilizing effect from information from official sources. And there does seem to be an association with levels of voter confidence, at least in the aggregate, and rates of communication on social media from voting officials. So that's kind of where we're at. We decided to craft an experiment to look into this. And we did a pilot in fall of 2022. We recruited a team of 9 student researchers to serve in 2 distinct roles for the experimental interventions. One student would serve as an administrator that would kind of run a Zoom session, and the other student would serve as a Confederate to deliver a given treatment in the course of the experiment. So we advertised this and offered modest course credit across a number of big intro classes. In order to participate, students had to provide some information to register, sign up for a Zoom time. At that point, they were consenting to the study. They would have to attend their Zoom session that was about 10 to 15 minutes. Immediately following the interactions, while they were still on the Zoom session, they took a survey. And then we also followed up with a post-election survey, which included the educational debrief and an opportunity for them to ask us to exclude their data, since we had deployed deception in the experiment. And out of this, we got 156 students who agreed to let us use their data. So when students showed up to their Zoom session, they were met by our student administrator, who had information on their home state from their registration and would talk them through the rules of casting an absentee ballot for their home state, would pull up the Secretary of State's website and walk them through dates and that kind of thing. Then they were told that they would be paired with a fellow student because research has shown that you retain information better if you talk about it with someone. So they would be paired with a fellow student to talk specifically about how to vote. They were discouraged from talking about things like personal opinions about candidates or parties. And at that point, the administrator would admit the fellow student, who was our research Confederate, who worked from a script and delivered a randomly assigned treatment. The Confederates who played the part of the fellow student, I mean, they were fellow students, right? But who acted as if they were just participating in the same study, practiced sort of steering the conversation. So they would initiate by asking the research subject, what do you have to do to vote in your state? And then regardless of what the student said, essentially, they would deliver a treatment, one of the 2 treatments, either, oh, wow, it's way harder to vote in my state, or, oh, wow, it's way easier. I don't have to do all those things in my state. The control was for the student researcher to say, yeah, that's about the same as what I have to do in my state. They had a follow-up statement pegged to the treatments or the control that mentioned things they had heard on the news. If they had it's a lot harder treatment, that would follow up by saying, I saw on the news that a lot of ballots get rejected because it's so hard that people can't figure it out. Or if it was the easier treatment, they would say, I see on the news that most ballots in our state get counted because it's just so easy to do. And then the control condition, I heard on the news that it doesn't really matter because every vote counts the same, or something to that effect. So then the Confederate researcher would surreptitiously text the student administrator after they had delivered the treatment scripts. The administrator would pop back in and say, okay, time's up. It's time to fill out now your survey. And so the research subject would work on their survey. They'd get a link in the chat, and the student researcher would look like they were working on their survey when they were in fact filling in a form of notes that we had for them to record for each of their Zoom sessions. So what do we think should have happened from this? Well, we look at effects on kind of 4 dimensions. Feelings about voting and election fairness, personal efficacy, and motivation to vote. So with the feelings about voting in the election fairness, we thought sort of there could be egotropic effects. If you hear that someone has it easier or harder, you may feel sort of worse or better about voting and about election fairness potentially. With the sociotropic expectations, though, we think that just learning that other people have to vote, have different rules to vote by, and potentially rules that are harder should have kind of perpetuate more negative feelings. In terms of personal efficacy and the vote motivation, there we think about how this kind of information might actually increase the cost of voting by introducing confusion. And so we expect lower voter confidence and motivation to vote. And so really quickly, I want to just show you some of these. And these are, again, 156 participants, pilot data. So when asked how advantaged, you can just see the very light blue is easier treatment, the middle blue is control, and the dark blue is harder. So a real nice step effect where the folks who heard that someone else had it easier to vote feel the most disadvantaged compared to the control condition and compared to those who heard someone has it harder to vote. So as we would expect if they were taking in the treatment. Now, across a range of feelings, notice just a couple things quickly. First of all, very minimal treatment effects with one exception, as in no treatment effects with one exception. And overall positive feelings about voting, right? Higher rates of agreement with the more sort of positive sentiments that we offered, and higher rates of disagreement with the more negative sentiments that we offered. The only feeling where we get a difference between those who received either of the treatments and the control is for the I feel confused. And there you'll notice that whether they got the easier or the harder treatment, they agree more with the sentiment of feeling confused than the folks in the control category. So if we just break it out with you getting any treatment versus the control, we see that real cleanly with confused, where again, there's no meaningful difference in how folks felt across that range of offered feelings. Now, in terms of fairness, if we look at, again, just getting any treatment versus the control, there we see elevated levels of perceptions of unfairness associated with having received one of the treatments relative to the controls. And if we break it out then by the type of treatment, what we can see is with feelings about your state's rules, that mirrors what we saw with the confused, right? Any treatment kind of elevates those feelings of unfairness. If we look at the attitudes towards US elections, it's really learning that somebody else had it harder to vote that's driving elevated concerns of unfairness there. Confidence. How confident are you that you can navigate the rules in your state, get an absentee ballot in on time? Again, anyone who got either of the treatments, anyone who learned the rules were different for someone else, has lower levels of confidence, as indicated by higher bars here. Not intuitive, I see that. And so in a sense, and I should say, no appreciable difference in voting, either reported vote intention at the time the survey was taken or self-reported voting in the post-election follow-up survey. So not seeing an effect on motivation to vote specifically, but seeing that getting that information about someone else having different rules does affect whether you feel advantaged or disadvantaged with your voting. It does seem to increase feelings of confusion. We see some effects with election fairness and with a sense of personal efficacy. Now, the one thing I want to say about how we think about what we did in this study based on what we think would actually happen, which I think will affect different aspects of this in different ways. But we built this study to explicitly tell students that someone else had to vote by different rules. We think what's more likely to happen is the scenario I described at the beginning, that someone who has to send their ballot in Illinois says, I have to get mine in by this date and I have to make sure it has this signature and that. And someone who has to send their ballot to Texas says, no, you don't. You have to get it in by this date. And they don't actually have the piece of the conversation where they realize that they're talking about different rules. But that's a, you know, for both logistical and ethical reasons, that's harder to implement in a study like this. What we would expect then is confusion to be potentially even higher than we've captured here, but maybe those perceptions of election fairness not to be affected if you're not actually being made aware that the rules are different in different states. And as far as, I mean, we used deception here, but we used it to mimic providing a kind of accurate information to voters. But it does suggest just sort of how easy it is to influence people's attitudes about the voting process by providing them any piece of information, even if it's potentially accurate. I think it also suggests that state level variation in voting rules opens up kind of some really ripe territory to be exploited for purposes of misinformation. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Emily. All right, next we have Christina with partisan colored glasses and tinfoil hats. Electoral illegitimacy in the 2020 and 2024 presidential elections. I remember when Christina was a student at Minnesota and is now an assistant professor. So welcome to the team. Go
Thank you
ahead.
so much, Betsy. Thank you. And I really do hope that everything is being shared the way that it should be.
Looks great.
Awesome. So we are talking about election legitimacy, and I really do, oops, sorry, really do appreciate you all bringing everything together, bringing all of us together. As someone who grew up in Colorado in a high fire warning area, I completely appreciate the challenges with uh, inconsistent Wi-Fi and air quality and inconsistent power. And so it really is an incredible feat to be able to be here together to talk with all of you about this research and everything that's going on here today. So I'm here to talk about perceptions of electoral legitimacy in the 2020 and 24 election. And the effects of this talk that we will see will certainly resonate deeply with Charles's talk earlier today, especially with some of the winner-loser effects that we certainly see in our data as well. So what's going on? We certainly see in democracies, elections are foundational to legitimate forms of authority. And when the process by which citizens choose their leaders is perceived to be fair and free, legitimacy is enhanced. And with that, the public gains trust in legal and political actors, institutions, and outcomes. And in short, perceived electoral legitimacy confers authority with the consent of the governed. However, we have to understand when the lack of legitimacy, real and or perceived, threatens our democracy and potentially our democratic stability. And in 2021, there was a suggestion that US may be entering into a backsliding democracy. And as we consider the effects of all of this, certainly taking into consideration the way in which Lynn highlighted this morning, objective context and processes having different effects than the perception of those contexts and processes, as well as the comments from our election officials and stakeholders this morning as they discussed the bomb threats and the conspiracy theories, the misinformation surrounding the 2024 election, only to affect the way in which people experienced and perceived that administration. And furthermore, as we see more political elites weaponize conspiracy theories and misinformation to mock and dismiss allegations against them or to impugn their political opponents, this leads us to consider, different dimensions. Why are we studying this? Why do we need to study this? So on one hand, are there any pros that we could consider of misinformation or conspiracy theory, conspiratorial thinking, conspiracy, conspiracism, all of the different terms? On one hand, there could be some pros in that, hang with me, I promise, that this kind of genuine inquiry could hold the election process more accountable. It could reinforce legitimacy and legality of the electoral process, especially if it reveals inconsistencies in official versions of events. It might be able to hold authorities accountable and even uncover real conspiracies that exist. It might allow people to use conspiracy theories to make sense of social and political realities and to express their values and moral feelings, and to explain or reinterpret uncertain events or disasters, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and the like. However, we should also be concerned. What are some of the cons with misinformation and conspiracy theories? Well, especially at the most extreme side, we certainly see that this can undermine the shared reality and understanding of civic life, can promote polarization and outgrow intolerance, can invite political discontent and extremism, and certainly incite political violence and direct attacks against democracy, as we happen to see in 2021. Now, this can also lead to election denial, destabilizing of democratic electoral processes, the eroding of trust in election administration, and increases in acceptance of political violence as an alternative. Now, taking all of that, where do we go from here? We're all here to talk about 2020 as a lead up and into 2024 that we just closed. Now, in 2020, we were faced with questions of election legitimacy and integrity of the entire electoral process dramatically in 2020. And perhaps this wasn't quite as surprising, as there were also some credible reasons to be concerned about the legitimacy of the 2020 election, given the context of the pandemic. There were also rising credible threats of electoral interference from foreign governments and a rise in major party leaders using falsehoods, conspiracy theories, just straight up misinformation about election fraud and the results of the election. Now we run into 2024, where we also had an unexpected candidate selection process. There were new threats of attempted electoral interference from foreign governments, as we heard from some of our speakers earlier today. Explicit and unabashed use of misinformation and conspiracy theories by main party candidates who said they're going to do it again simply just to control the media cycle. And of course, reinforced election denial for the results of the 2020 election. This led us to, so my co-author Joe Vitrell at Lehigh University and I, after the 2016 election, we sought to explain different factors to predict the acceptance and perceived fairness and legitimacy of the 2020 election. What we didn't foresee is that we're going to be able to put together an entire six-wave panel pre and post 2020, 2022, and 2024 elections. So we took that information to explore election legitimacy perceptions, and political psychology helps us to understand that. So we have some context of the political context for the 2020 and 2024 elections, but we also wanted to look at how might other types of explanations help us understand this. So certainly political motivated reasoning, conspiracism, disaffection, normative threat, group affect, and media exposure. And we are seeking to test these hypotheses against one another. The data that we bring to bear here, we have a replication sample pre and post for the 2020 election. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. The results look very similar to the way in which the 2020 data shows up in our forthright sample. In our second sample from forthright, collected from Bovitz International, we were able to quota sample. So we have closer approximations of national representativeness. And we have more than 1,000 respondents starting at wave one, and we have been able to, over 4 years, maintain over 30% of the sample in responses. And so I'll be focusing on waves 1 and waves 2 around the 2020 election, and waves 5 and wave 6 around the 2024 election. I unfortunately don't have time today to talk about some of the changes within subjects here. And so I look forward to talking more about that at a later date. So what did we explore? So we were interested in these key measures, our main outcomes around election legitimacy. We started with perceptions of perceived election fraud. This is the same 11-item index that Charles mentioned during his presentation as well. So questions around perceptions of ineligible voters, is the election going to be rigged, influences from foreign influences, media trying to influence the election, and the such. We're also interested in perceptions of the election outcome and its fairness. These are measures post-election, both 2020 and 24, as well as how probable is it that someone's going to accept the actual election outcome. So in order to explore that with our hypotheses, we use both partisanship and ideology to explore political motivated reasoning. I'll focus only on partisanship today, but the effects are very similar. We'll also look at the effects of conspiracism with a measure of conspiratorial predispositions through Joe Usinski's measure of conspiratorial thinking. We'll also look at disaffection, so measures of loss of control through a measure of learned helplessness, political efficacy, both internal and external, as well as trust and interest. Then we start to get into some other descriptors or other explanations with regard to normative threat. So this is a measure or the perception that the defining values of society are under threat because of social change and not liking what that social change actually is. And then we also look at group affect. So we look at preferences towards groups in the majority and preferences towards groups in the minority and index those together. The index around majority group affect is around Christian and white groups, and the minority group comes together with measures of Black, Latine, Asian, Muslim, and Jewish groups. We, of course, would be remiss if we didn't account for media exposure as well. And so we look at the way in which our respondents look at mainstream, liberal, and conservative media across different forms of media. And of course, our demographic controls and political knowledge, everything is scaled from 0 to 1. So I have a lot of results. I'm going to fly through a few and kind of gloss over a couple of others. Interestingly here with motivated reasoning, we see a pretty clear winner-loser effect, just as we would expect. And so here we see, so there's the 2020 panel will show up on the top, 2024 on the bottom, and then the difference measure, so the change of what happens from post minus pre is on the far right, just to orient you all. So partisanship very clearly motivates electoral legitimacy, especially for our losers. In 2020, Democrats won and the fraud belief dropped significantly, but Republicans' perception increased significantly. In 2020, this flipped where Democrats lost and fraud belief increased significantly post-election, but Republicans still increased slightly. This is only marginally significant. Okay. What about for election fairness? Now, election fairness, we see fairly similar effects. So Democrats are much more willing to accept the results of the election after 2020 election. They certainly see it as more fair. This certainly drops off after Democrats lose the election in 2024. And Republicans, interestingly enough, actually don't see the outcome as more fair in 2024, despite winning the election. And so we have to wonder, is this related to influences of rhetoric and certainly political elites starting in 2020, also influencing the framing of the 2024 election? And for outcome acceptance, for Democrats, 2020, they win. They're very willing to accept the outcome. This drops off precipitously for 2024, where they lose the election. Interestingly, Republicans still look very similar from 2020 to 2024 in their willingness to accept the election, still significantly more so than Democrats in 2024, but not that much more than in 2024. What about conspiracism? So here I'm going to focus on what happens with our Democrats and our Republicans in 2020 and 2024. So here we see as conspiratorial thinking increases we do see that post-election Republicans become more open to or perceive more election fraud, and Democrats become less. There's really no consistent effect difference in 2024. Now, what about election fairness? So post-election, interestingly, we see for Republicans, as we would expect, as conspiratorial thinking increases, they become less, they see the election as less fair. Similarly, also in 2024, despite winning the election, there's no effect for Democrats in 2024. The effect is flat. But Democrats in 2020, an interesting effect. We see as conspiratorial thinking increases, they see the election as more fair. Some of this may be due to the way in which conspiracy theories about the election and the election outcome affected the context and how folks were experiencing the election, and possibly that led them to see the election even as more fair. I don't know, that might be a stretch. Happy to talk a little bit more about that further. We see some similar effects for outcome acceptance as well. I'm not going to talk much about disaffection. There's some kind of inconsistent results for disaffection. I want to get more to our results about normative threat. So again, this is our effects of system identity threat. So the perception that defining values of society are under threat due to social change. We see fairly consistently for 2020, as we would expect, those perceived threats for Republicans. They're going to be more willing to see perceptions of election fraud post-election. And Democrats are going to see less fraud. Democrats won, again, that winner-loser effect. What's interesting, though, is we see that flip a little bit in 2024. So the effects for Democrats is fairly flat, but for Republicans in winning the election, the effects of system identity threats, those normative threats, even as the threats become greater, they did win the election and they do see less fraud in the election. Now, we see some similar effects for outcome fairness and for outcome acceptance. And so fairly flat effects for Democrats. In 2020, we do see an effect precipitously for 2020 that as system identity threat increases, they do see the election as less fair and are less willing to accept the outcome of the election. Now, I have group affect and a brief comment on media exposure before I wrap up. So on group affect, so for preferences towards minority groups, we do see that this decreases election fraud perception, particularly during the 2020 election, and it increases the perception of fairness post-election and the probability of accepting the outcome in both the 2020 and the 2024 elections. Now, the majority group preference does predict increased perceived election fraud in 2020, as we might expect, but not in 2024. So this was a little surprising. It does also predict reduced fairness perceptions pre and post-election in both 20 and 24 elections. And it also explains a lower probability of accepting the outcome in 2020. Again, and higher in 2024. Some of this may be due to the way in which these group preferences track with partisanship and ideology. Thank you. And so as we move forward, I won't get into if anyone wants to go through the slides, I'm happy to go through that in Q&A. Now, what about media exposure? Now, liberal media did little to reduce fraud beliefs, but did improve perceived fairness in 2020 and 2024 and reduce the acceptance in 2024. Mainstream media did reduce fraud belief and improve perceived fairness in 2020, but not in 2024. So I have to wonder what might be happening there. And conservative media behaved just as we would have expected. It increased fraud belief in 2020 and reduced perceived fairness in both 2020 and 2024, and also reduced the acceptance of the 2020 election, but not in 2024. So that says that there's something also about the media exposure in the media environment in 2024, or sorry, 2020 versus 2024. So this is the results summary. It's in the slides. I'm not going to rehash that. We did run fully kitchen sink combined models. We find very consistent effects for political motivated reasoning and conspiracism. Less consistent effects for media exposure and normative threat, some for group affect. Other effects drop out or become inconsistent across the different elections and electoral contexts. Again, this is the same group of people in our panel data. So there is something more to be teased out there. There's very little multicollinearity in our data, but there's also an open question of maybe these models might be overspecified. So we're working to dig into that and understand our panel data and its consistency, particularly with panels being collected over the course of 4 years. Ensuring that the same person in the household answered the survey in 2020 as they did in 2024. So we're doing some data checks on that. So as we wrap up, to quote Chris Federico, partisanship is certainly a hell of a drug. And we find that so is conspiratorial thinking or conspiracism. But we can't ignore the effects of context and media exposure as well. Now, as we move forward, we're also interested in other alternative explanations, such as the effects of authoritarianism, cognitive sophistication, anti-intellectualism. And after Charles's presentation this morning, considering we do have data on this, voting experiences. How did our respondents experience the voting process? We're starting to unpack, now that we have all 6 waves, what does this look like for experiences and attitudes from 2020 influencing experiences and attitudes for 2024? So if anyone has some creative ideas about panel analyses, please send them my way. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Christina. All right, next we have Lisa Bryant with Election Skepticism and Election Administration, How Misinformation Leads to Administrative Change.
Okay, great. So I'm presenting this today with Paul Manson. We will be trading off, so we'll see. We're the first co-presenters, I think, so we'll see how that works maybe. So ours is a good follow-up to Christina's, because ours is the impact of election skepticism on local election officials. And this research is motivated in part by the 2020 election deniers, and it's sort of a marriage of 2 research projects. My Carnegie research looking at how polarization has impacted the process of running elections, and Manson and Garkey's EVIC research, where they've been doing interviews with local election officials. So we sort of brought those together. So in 2020, election deniers really focused, if you remember, the rhetoric was a lot on hacking and rigging, right? That this sort of external threats to election results. But as we moved into 2022, and when people started, the big lie and started really questioning the results of the 2020 election, we saw those election skepticism wasn't so much about people committing fraud as much, or people committing, outside threats from foreign entities, but there were a lot of threats against election officials themselves. And so several election officials experienced harassment. There were kidnapping threats, of course, some people remember. There were attempts to try and shut down election centers. And all kinds of things like that. And so we wondered, how did election officials respond to these threats going into 2023 and 2024? And did they change any sort of policies or processes in response to these effects? We know that some of these election skeptics had very orchestrated efforts, and so they might have been similar across states or within a state across jurisdictions, but some of the attempts were pretty widespread. And so basically, our motivating question is, how do election officials respond to these conditions and to election skeptics themselves? So the research questions we have is, to what extent did election officials report difficulties with election skeptics? Did they view, talking sort of about Christina's thing, did they view parties or ideological groups as sort of the election skepticism source, or did they think this was just sort of individually motivated actors acting alone? We looked at what types of threats election officials experienced when they did receive threats. And then, did the experiences they have dealing with skeptics and threats in various formats cause them to change policies or procedures within their jurisdiction? This is not necessarily changing election law, although some election officials did try to attempt to get election laws changed, which we could talk about more in Q&A, but this is about things that maybe might be within their control. In order to measure these, I included some questions on the 2024 EVIC National Local Election Official Survey, which Gronke and Manson have run for several years now. I don't know, Manson can give you specifics. And we had 659 online and mail responses to that survey. And there was question batteries about both election skeptics and dealing with skeptics in various formats, and then what types of threats were received. And then Manson will report about a series of national interviews that they've done with local election officials talking about their experiences. So first thing, 76% of local election officials reported that they had to deal with election skeptics in one capacity or another. And so a follow-up question asked, in what capacities did you experience these difficulties? And so this graph shows that the dark blue are significant and moderate difficulties, and the light blue are some and minor difficulties. And so you can see general public, right, voters and people in the community were the majority of the people that they had to deal with. And a combined sort of 76% or so had some sort of difficulty with election skeptics in their community. The next biggest category is election observers, and then poll workers. And Paul's going to talk a little bit about, maybe challenges that they presented. But then interestingly, we asked also about staff. Permanent staff was fairly low, but temporary staff was a little bit higher. And so over, nearly 20% had some difficulties with people working as temporary staff during the elections. And then maybe even more interesting is if we go down to the far right side of the graph, election officials report having difficulties with their county election officials. There's some really obviously famous cases about this, like Shasta County, California, where the county officials wanted to demand like full hand counts of ballots, right? But these are people who fund elections often and who might be able to dictate whether or not election officials get the resources they need. So if you have skeptics in those positions, it could certainly cause problems. And then of course there's state legislators, right? And people who are making laws about elections. So I'm going to turn it over. We also asked if they had experienced any threats, and we divided it up in the last 3 months, in the last 1 year, or over the last year. And you can see about 70% of election officials received some threats, maybe over the last year. But even within the last year, about half of election officials are receiving some threats, mostly in the form of insults and harassment. But then there's actual overt threats as well. And then very minor sort of attacks and property damage and malicious impersonation, which is good, right? But the fact that the numbers are so high on insult, harassment, and threat is probably not good. So now I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, and thanks for the invite. And it's great to be able to share these findings here. So to add some qualitative flavor to this. So myself and a team here with EVIC and Portland State University, we're in the process of expanding national interviews right now, building off of some work we did in Oregon with the Oregon Association of County Clerks and the Secretary of State's office here. And both in the survey data and the interviews, the three pieces we want to capture here are really the change in the workload, that managing myths or disinformation is really occupying the local election officials, primarily the chief local election officials themselves, a lot of their time as they navigate, as we heard in some of the earlier parts of the panel, these choices on how you manage the statutory timelines for responding to them, deciding what's allowed to be released. I think Commissioner Hovland mentioned this in the discussion with the EAC panel. And the public records requests and observers really are shifting some of the behaviors in the office and how resources are allocated for managing elections. And I think one of the worries that's been shared both here and in our interviews is this concern that public records requests or these inquiries represent some sort of a denial of service attack, or sort of an effort to jam up the gears of local election offices. And they're struggling to decide how to respond to those. And I want to differentiate too. We do hear about two types of skeptical challenges, I guess I'll put it. There's local-based ones, and then there's these sort of national campaigns. And the national ones are sort of, you notice them quickly as I talk with local election officials, they're asking questions that are probably being distributed through social networks. I think we had a great paper earlier today on, was it peer-to-peer communication, like WhatsApp campaigns. So There's public records requests that are being shared through those, they're being copied. And you sort of notice those, I'm sitting in a state that's universal vote by mail. And so when public records requests come into an Oregon clerk asking about polling places, well, you sort of know what's going on a little bit there, that the inquiries are not so local. But then there are very much local challenges, individuals that are there. So, no, that's perfectly said. So the next slide, what I'll do here is I'm going to share some of the clerk's own words themselves out of these interviews. On that first point about how the work of managing misinformation is taking up so much energy, we had one clerk in particular just say that it's most of their time now as a clerk. They're managing these challenges. And that sort of second line in the first block there, the biggest fear is not being able to serve the public because we're responding to misinformation. And so from the local election officials, I think it's no surprise based on anyone here who's done work with local offices, this is really straining resources. And just, this last statement here, we're hard workers and we're trying to get it done daily. And there's these interferences that just make it a lot more difficult than they need to be. And so there's this frustration about how this flow comes in. I tried to find a photo. I don't have, there's a clerk here in Oregon who was kind enough to send me a photo of the stack of public records requests they had prior to 2020 and then what they're having now. And it's this sort of pile of paper on top of the desk. And it's a nice visual on how much that increase has occurred. So we know this is a stress. So now on to the threats. Lisa talked a bit about what we heard in our survey. And just to mention, we're grateful here. This is the local election official survey has been running since 2018 with support both from Democracy Fund, Election Trust Initiative, and then the interviews with the Bipartisan Policy Center. The pressure that's coming from these threats is showing up at multiple levels. So we heard about poll workers becoming reticent to come back. Clerks sort of shared with us that some of these long-term poll workers or temporary workers, judges who are working election boards are seeing this threat environment, this sort of hostile environment come up, and either they don't want to come back or we've heard that their spouses are worried about them. So you can sort of imagine one of these individuals, maybe he's a retiree, likely a woman. What are sort of the aspects of both being older and a woman facing this sort of hostile environment? You may not come back. You may not be interested in. So that's a strain on recruitment. Also in the hiring for staff, a similar story. You have a choice. You can work in the county treasurer's office, or you can work in the assessor's office, or come over to elections where the pay might be a bit lower and you're going to get yelled at. And so this is a headwind for some of the hires. They realize what they're getting into, and clerks have shared with us that that's now think about different skill sets you might look for. So people who are good at engaging the public, and those are soft skills that we have a hard time inventorying when we look across the landscape on studying hiring. How can people sort of de-escalate or use soft skills? And then there's a real personal toll. I'll say for the Oregon study, we interviewed 34 of 36 counties. 1 out of 5 interviews, we had to pause. It just became too emotional. We had to take a break, and it was largely around this question of what's happening in their communities when it comes to threats and harassment. Now, the next slide has a little bit of that language here and getting a sense about it. There's a sense of loss out of these threats. Local election officials can't celebrate their successes because they're sort of constantly on the back foot reacting. This second part of this statement here is, for a long time, I quit telling people what I do when I meet them. I was afraid what their reaction would be. I say I work for the government. I say I work in county government. And so there's a real sort of loss of identity here. So on a very personal sort of psychological level, these threats are changing how folks can really sort of get a sense of fulfillment out of the work. And that final line here, I'm really proud of what I do, and hopefully we'll get back to a place where it's better. So these threats really have a very negative personal effect, a sort of psychological effect that I think we've known about anecdotally, and we're trying to capture here through the interviews. Lisa, you can go into the next. And so changes in practices, I think, Lisa, you'll take over here.
Yeah, so we asked, what sort of things have you changed in response to these threats? And the number one thing that we saw was security measures. And you can see that security measures in voting locations was a big one. And I think, Paul can back this up, is that when you talk to the local election officials, especially about threats, most of which are fueled by misinformation, they always say they want to protect their poll workers and they want to protect their staff. And so a lot of these security changes are really motivated by their desire to protect the people who work for them. And so you can see of the people who changed policies, changing voting locations, and then ramping up security in their elections office, right? We have an election official actually on this call today, this conference today, who, had to have the sheriff's department come and lock down their office. And that was not an uncommon experience for election officials in 2022. And so some have, we were told we can't afford bulletproof glass, but we can afford shatterproof glass. And that's like the best we can do. But the fact that our local election officials are thinking about installing bulletproof glass in their offices, right, that's a sort of change that they're trying to make and money that they're trying to find. Some of them changed voting locations to make them more secure and less vulnerable to people. Obviously, changing how public records requests are handled in their offices to the extent that they're handled locally. They're pushing more of them, like Paul alluded to, up to the state. Or they're making it more formal. So some of them said, you used to be able to just walk in and sort of ask me information. They're not doing that anymore. And then, of course, there's some abilities to change who's observing elections or putting more restrictions. Under other, there were some things like there are offices now that all the poll workers and election workers are wearing security buzzers on their wrists the whole time that they're working, things like that. So you can see that there are a number of changes that they've been making within their offices. Sorry, Paul, if I stepped on your toes.
No, this is perfect. I mean, and just again, to put a personal touch on it, this was part of what Lisa was talking about, that change in what the skill sets are, what you have to do in the office. So, de-escalation training, active shooter training, thinking really about the space and room. That middle part of this quote, we were talking with the local election official, the older building is set up such that where they're doing the ballot opening and sorting, it's a dead end, but it's a public building. And so folks are coming and going, maybe using the restroom, visiting the sheriff's office. They really had to think sort of defensively about how do you get out? And the final piece here, just being really mindful that sort of what's happening at national level is inspiring a lot of that local challenge I was sharing earlier. So whether it's the copying of a public records request elsewhere, it's more this sort of tone and this sort of vitriol that comes with it that's coming down from the national level. At least you can move to the next.
Oh, I clicked on the chat, sorry. Yes. So in conclusion, we basically say skeptics, and I saw Charles' note about deniers, and I will say I was very careful in my writing to actually use skeptics and not deniers, so that was sloppy on my first slide. But these skeptics have caused issues for local election officials, and we've seen how sort of threats based around misinformation and claims around misinformation have actually caused them to make some changes in the way that their elections and especially their election offices and polling locations are run. And so we wonder, will this continue with 2024's election going a little more smoothly, bomb threats and Dropbox fires aside? Will this continue, or will we see changes? And so both Paul and I are still working on more interviews with election officials, and I'm hoping to do some interviews with skeptics, especially skeptics who are serving in offices as election officials, because that was one of the other questions on the survey that we didn't present today, but about 12% of local election officials reported being somewhat skeptical themselves. And so I hope to do some follow-up interviews with them. Thank you.
I am really excited to announce our last panelist of the day, Thad Kauser, who served as a incredible literature reference throughout the panel. So Thad,
all right,
turn. Go for it. We're ready to
Okay.
learn from you.
Thank you so much, Betsy. And again, I want to echo everyone's thanks to Betsy and Mike for really pivoting and providing a really fruitful, really informative conference that I've learned so much about. And my colleagues, Seth Hill, Bob Stein, and Neil Malhotra, and I are looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions about this research, which shares the results from a large-scale field experiment in the 2024 presidential election, designed to test whether these public information campaigns that we've been talking about through much of the day can truly impact public trust in elections. So our research question is, can messages that inform voters about protections on the integrity of the vote actually move the needle when it comes to shaping trust in elections? Or is everything really driven by the winner-loser effect and by what elites are saying or what people are saying online on Facebook and Instagram? So we want to answer this question in a way that hopefully is convincing to you and convinces us by asking, really, are these effective? Do we know that there's true cause and effect in the impact of these campaigns? And do they work in the real world? as you heard a little bit about in the first panel today, and as every election official in the country knows, the job of election officials changed dramatically with the 2020 election. They went from having to run trustworthy elections, in Charles Stewart's terminology, to continuing to have to run trustworthy elections, but also actively convincing people to trust them. So one of the tools that they have turned to use is radical transparency and proactive communication. We've seen, this is Dean Logan. We see some examples from others from Virginia that had a really professionally done set of communications designed to show who the real people were behind elections. We see groups like Contra Costa, Tommy Gong's County, that is showing people in videos the nuts and bolts of signature verification, as well as trying to use the effects of attention grabbing graphics. We see the Arizona Secretary of State trying to pre-bunk this concern about how long it takes election results to be counted. The state of Georgia did a large-scale public information campaign in 2022, and Stephen Richer's office in Maricopa County were perhaps the most aggressive and inventive in running sort of multi-million-dollar, multimodal transparency and trust campaigns designed to move the needle on public confidence in elections. And so the question is, does any of this really work? We've been partnering with election officials in 5 different states over the last few years to try to test their messages, to see what works, what doesn't work, and what works best in order to guide their campaigns. But if you look at the literature on what drives the trust in elections, and I won't linger over this because Charles Stewart covered it so well earlier today, we have pretty strong evidence about the big drivers of election trust. The loser effect. If your candidate loses, your trust immediately goes down in elections. We have that Betsy Sinclair's work. We have observational and experimental evidence. We also know that if your party's candidate claims fraud, again, from observational as well as experimental evidence, we know that this drives down trust. And for work that Mike, Lisa, Bryant, and others have done, the mode of voting in the voter experience has a big effect on trust. If you have a bad experience at the polls, you're going to trust elections less. So can you increase trust in elections? Well, there's a set of new emerging survey experimental works that seem to say yes. So in the context of a survey, when we show people either a message or a video designed to inform them about the protections on trust from the Dartmouth team, the Stanford team, and then 2 papers forthcoming from our UC San Diego Yankelovich Center team, we have strong evidence that at least in this survey experimental context, you can see large increases in trust after watching a video from an election official or hearing a message about trust. But when you go outside of the survey experimental realm, the results are less clear. Leah Maravaki and Mara Sutman-Leah's work that was referenced earlier today on the hashtag Trusted Messenger campaign found no results in an observational study showing exposure to that social media campaign didn't seem to drive trust. There are mixed results from 2 past lab experiments. And in the one field experiment that we know of on this, Dan Biggers and others found that sort of 1 letter sent to people didn't move the needle on trust or turnout when they learned about ballot tracking. So as we sat back to see whether what we've found in survey experiments actually works in the real world, we thought of the key features that we would want in a study. You want to have randomization, right? That gold standard of cause and effect, where you have a treatment and a control group who don't receive messages. You want this to be done at the individual level and not have spillover across households, because in the real world, people are receiving many of these messages and sharing it with others in their household. Importantly, you want to measure the impacts of these trust building campaigns in a way that's separate from the treatments, because there's a real risk of that there are demand effects, right? I watch a treatment, I respond to a survey, I'm just going to say, yeah, I'm a little bit more trusting, but that could fade if I'm not trying to please the interviewer. And we want to have some kind of a pre-test measure of trust. When you look at external validity, you want to embed this research in the context of a real election campaign when there are so many messages, when Donald Trump or someone else is making claims of fraud, when people are seeing on Facebook and Instagram misinformation about election fraud. So you want to do it in the midst and in the maw of an election campaign. You would want to have messages designed not by political scientists, but by professional political consultants, right? People who are really doing this because that's going to get you the best verisimilitude. You'd want people to receive these messages in the realistic way that people do in the way they experience in public information campaigns. So getting them through the mail, through social media, through the television or cable that they watch, rather than when they're sitting there with their eyeballs completely focused in a survey experimental campaign. And you'd like to look at how it moves the needle on both attitudes and behavior to see to see the extent to which its impacts are reverberating across the way people vote and how they vote. All right. So fortunately, we were able to do this due to the commitment of the Houston Endowment, which is a nonprofit in Houston that came to us after seeing some of our findings in Texas, and said, hey, we want to fund a public information campaign to increase trust among conservative voters in the greater Houston area, so Harris County and all of the surrounding counties. And they were willing to invest strongly about $600,000 in a professional political consultant to design and run a multimedia campaign. And then our team's role was to evaluate, to make sure that it was set up for causal inference and to then evaluate the impacts. So we've done that by designing a study that has all those key features that I just laid out, pre-registering it. This was conducted in September and October of 2024 during this presidential election. And we worked with this consultant to design a survey in July of 2024 to find out what do people trust and not trust about elections in Houston, and who would they listen to. We had 70,000 voters in the treatment group, a slightly larger control group. They received the treatment through digital video, so on social media and on the kind of second tier streaming platforms like Tubi, Hulu, and Fubo, in which we can do one-to-one treatment, and they received postcards and text messages. They were surveyed afterwards through text message in a way that was unrelated to this campaign about their trust in Harris County, in voting by mail, and about their own vote in the national vote. We randomized by household and confirmed that there was balance across all of the demographics. The pre-survey that informed this campaign, which was done by a group called Signal with 800 voters in July, found that for the most part, conservatives were pretty confident that their own vote would be counted and that their own county would cast votes correctly. But here's what they didn't trust. They didn't trust Harris County, very demographically and politically different county. That's the heart of Houston. And they didn't trust voting by mail. So those were the two big problem areas. How do you address those problems? Well, when we asked a series of questions about, taken from the SPAE questions that Charles shared earlier about, well, what do you know about, and what would you trust if it was done in your jurisdiction? What we found was the biggest driver of trust was if people knew that law enforcement actually prosecuted fraud and was involved in like the chain of custody for ballots. So some of the messages that they designed were focused on that. They had people like Constable Ted Heap in Texas, who is a constable. It's sort of like a sheriff, but they play a direct role in chain of custody for ballots and in prosecuting fraud. And he was here to secure your ballot, whether it's by mail, early voting, or on election day. So again, hitting that area, voting by mail, which people are concerned with the messenger who they might listen to. Let's see if I can play a video. This was an example of one of the videos.
This is Constable Ted Heap. In Texas, we enforce our election laws. So if you're thinking about cheating, I say go ahead. We can't wait to meet you. It's safe, it's secure, it's your vote.
Right. So we sort of have a Dirty Harry of elections, right, who is talking about ways in which your vote will be secured. And this is speaking in the language that conservatives will listen to, at least in the judgment of the political consultants who designed this campaign that we were not involved in designing. After they ran it, we worked with them to analyze survey evidence on those 4 trust questions, and to look at verified voter turnout to see whether it affected turnout with a pre-registered hypothesis that it could potentially increase turnout through increasing trust. Now, what did we hope to find? Well, here's what we had found in a paper that's forthcoming in the British Journal of Political Science that Jen Gaudet is the lead author of. When we did 5 survey experiments testing 10 different messages across the country, we found that 4 out of the 10 had null effects. The 6 that did have effects had effects ranging from 2.5% increases in the percent of people who said that they trusted elections most or all the time, ranging up all the way to 13 percentage points. So some really large numbers, but many around 2.5 or 4%. What do we think we might find? Well, we thought we could either find that these campaigns don't work, they have zero impact. It might have worked, but been so small that we couldn't detect it, or we could find a detectable impact based on this strong causal inference design. What do we find? Well, this is a regression of our 4 dependent variables in each column. Your trust in your personal vote would be counted, Harris County voting by mail, or and then whether you thought fraud was frequent overall. And what we found was 3 out of the 4 were positive, but only 1 was statistically significant. So this election campaign detectably moved the dial, comparing treatment to control group on people's trust that voting by mail was a secure process. The scale of that effect, 1.3 percentage points. These are linear probability models, 1.3 percentage points. So that's a little just over half the size of the weakest effect that we found in the survey experiments. So it was not moving the needle nearly as much as we saw in the survey experiments. But again, this is in the midst of an election campaign with countervailing messages, with questions asked at a much later point in time. Did it change rate of turnout? It did not have a detectable effect on the rate of turnout. In a hypothesis that we did not pre-register, so in our exploratory analysis, we looked and saw that it changed the rate of people voting by mail. In fact, it reduced the rate of people voting by mail, and that's what the first column shows you. And that effect was all concentrated among the people who had voted by mail in 2020 or 2022. Those who were exposed to this campaign were less likely to vote by mail. Why is that the case? Because it's initially puzzling, right? They trust voting by mail. They trust the vote by mail process more, but they are less likely to personally engage in it. Our post hoc explanation is that by learning about all the protections about vote by mail ballots, such as signature verification, they might have thought, well, that sounds like a lot of trouble and my ballot might be invalidated. So even though I trust the aggregate process more, I want to vote in person on election day. Again, that's a post hoc exploratory hypothesis. Where do we think this leaves us? Well, it shows that a public information campaign can indeed have a detectable impact on trust, even in the midst of a contentious presidential election, among a group that might be the least likely to be affected by it, conservative voters in a red state. But it does show that the impact is much smaller than we've seen in some of these survey experiments, tempering some of our optimism about them as a panacea, and showing that they're about half the size of the least impactful video, and that they don't affect turnout, but they do change behavioral measures of some type. So I think it leaves us saying that this really important, really hard work that election officials are doing can pay off, but it needs to be part of an overall campaign, and it's not going to move the needle as much as winning and losing elections and elite claims of fraud. All right, thanks so much.
I think with this, we're at the close of day 1. So this has been the most amazing experience as an online conference. I'm really appreciative of how much everyone has engaged. I think, I can see all of you rallying around the reality that like we are here because of a disaster, but we've gotten to really build out this community. We've had 288 registrants come in through the door today, which is like really think about magnifying the impact of this. It's the silver lining of the fire. We're going to be back tomorrow at 7:45 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And so wake up early, come back for the fun. Feel free to include your friends in what happens. We're really appreciative that you joined us today, and so we're looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. And with that, I'm gonna close out the night.
Thank you all.